May 31, 2009, 1929 UTC, Rio de Janeiro Galeão International Airport. An Airbus A330 pushes back from the gate. Registration, FGZCP. Flight number, AF447. Destination, Paris Charles de Gaulle. Flight time, 11 hours. 216 passengers, 12 crew members, 228 souls aboard. The A330 had never killed anyone in passenger service. Since its introduction in 1994, 15 years of commercial operations, 0 fatal accidents. The aircraft was equipped with fly-by-wire technology, computer systems designed to prevent pilot error, to make catastrophic mistakes physically impossible. Pitch too steep? The computer corrects it. Bank too far? Impossible. Fly too slow? The system won't let you stall. This was the safest airplane in the sky. In exactly 6 hours, 45 minutes, and 28 seconds, all 228 people aboard would be dead. This is the story of how the impossible happened, and how 4 minutes and 23 seconds of confusion over the Atlantic Ocean changed aviation forever. At 58 years old, Captain Marc Dubois was a veteran. Nearly 11,000 flight hours, 1,700 hours on the A330. He'd been flying for Air France since 1988, working his way up from Air Inter. 16 rotations in the South American sector since joining the A330 division in 2007. His father, Jean-Paul Dubois, had also been an Air France pilot. The aviation gene ran deep in the family. But Dubois had barely slept. According to the BEA investigation, he'd gotten only 1 hour of rest before boarding AF447. He'd spent his 3-day layover in Rio with his girlfriend, an off-duty flight attendant and opera singer. They'd been seen out on the town the night before departure. This wasn't unusual. The Rio rotation was coveted among Air France pilots precisely because of the beachside hotels in Copacabana, the restaurants, the nightlife. In the right seat was First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, age 32. Total flight hours, 2,936. He was relatively inexperienced, having recently graduated from Air France's in-house training program. He'd qualified on the A330 only 11 months earlier, in June 2008. He'd completed just 5 rotations in the South American sector. For this trip, he'd brought his wife Isabelle along, leaving their children at home in France. The third pilot was First Officer David Robert, age 37, 6,547 total flight hours, with 40,179 on the A330. Robert had graduated from École Nationale de l'Aviation Civile, one of France's elite grandes écoles. Unlike Bonin, he was no longer just a pilot. He'd transitioned into a management position at Air France's operations center, joining flight crews occasionally to maintain his type rating. He'd completed 39 rotations in the South American sector since 2002. 3 pilots. Combined experience, over 20,000 flight hours, on what should have been a routine overnight flight across the Atlantic. The Airbus A330-203, registered FGZCP, had rolled off the production line on February 25, 2005. It was delivered new to Air France and had been meticulously maintained. Just 2 months before this flight, it had undergone a complete overhaul. The only technical issue noted before departure was a minor problem with one of the 3 radio management panels. Nothing concerning. Nothing that would ground the aircraft. The plane was worth approximately $158 million. It was equipped with state-of-the-art technology, fly-by-wire flight controls, multiple redundant systems, computers that monitored every aspect of flight. The A330 was designed to be pilot-proof. Even if a crew made errors, the aircraft's protections would save them. But there was something else aboard FGZCP that night. Something small. Something that had been flagged as a problem but not deemed urgent enough to fix immediately. 3 pitot tubes. Model, Thales C165AA. Cost, approximately €8,500 for the complete set. Pitot tubes are deceptively simple devices, forward-facing tubes about the size of an adult hand, mounted on the fuselage, that measure air pressure to calculate airspeed. They're heated by electrical resistance to prevent ice formation. Critical instruments. Without accurate airspeed data, modern aircraft cannot function properly. And the Thales AA model pitot tubes had a known vulnerability. In September 2007, Airbus had recommended replacing the Thales C1 pitot tubes with a newer model, the C1 because of reports of water ingress. It wasn't an airworthiness directive, just a recommendation. Airlines could implement it at their discretion. Air France had implemented the change on its A320 fleet, where the incidents had been observed. But for the A330 and A340 fleet, they decided to replace the tubes only when failures started occurring. In May 2008, failures began. By 2009, the problems had accelerated dramatically. Between 2003 and 2007, there were only 9 reported problems with frozen Thales AA pitot tubes on Airbus A330 aircraft. In 2008 alone, 16 occurrences. In the first 5 months of 2009, 10 more. The European Aviation Safety Agency knew about the problem. ESA had analyzed pitot probe icing events and confirmed the severity of the failure. But they had decided not to make the probe change mandatory. An internal Air France directive from February 2009 ordered that all Thales AA pitot tubes be replaced by June 2009. FGZCP was scheduled for the replacement upon its arrival in Paris. But on May 31, 2009, the old tubes were still installed. The flight was cleared for departure. After all, the atmospheric conditions that could cause the problem were considered extremely rare. High altitude, ice crystals, not supercooled water. Specific temperature ranges between -10 and -40 degrees Celsius. High humidity. The convergence of all these factors? Unlikely. Except that on this night, AF447 would fly directly into exactly those conditions. At 22:29 UTC, 7:29 p.m. local time, Flight 447 lifted off from Rio de Janeiro. The takeoff was normal. The climb was smooth. Bonin was the pilot flying. Though with the autopilot engaged, there was little for him to do. Dubois monitored the instruments. Robert headed to the crew rest area to sleep, standard procedure for long-haul flights. The captain would take the second break. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, flight level 350, and proceeded northeast along the Brazilian coast. The cockpit atmosphere was relaxed. Dubois pointed out the equator as they crossed it. Bonin joked about feeling the bump. An hour passed. Everything according to plan. At approximately 0030 UTC, the crew received information about a convective zone ahead of them. A band of thunderstorms. Other flights in the area that night made diversions to avoid the worst of the weather system. AF447 did not. The crew studied the pattern briefly, but requested no route change. They would fly through it. At 0133 UTC, AF447 made its last voice contact with air traffic control. Brazilian Oceanic Control Center, Atlântico, instructed them to remain at flight level 350. "Okay, will do," Captain Dubois replied. His voice was calm, routine. 17 seconds of audio. The last time anyone on the ground would hear from Flight 447. At 0148 UTC, 15 minutes after crossing the INTOL waypoint, AF447 dropped off Brazilian radar screens. This was expected. They were entering a no-radar zone over the mid-Atlantic, a gap in coverage between Brazilian and Senegalese airspace. They would fly blind to ground control for over 2 hours. The aircraft's ACARS system, Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, would continue sending automated position reports via satellite every 10 minutes. At 0155 UTC, Captain Dubois woke David Robert. "He's going to take my place," Dubois said, gesturing toward Bonin. After a brief handover between the two first officers, Dubois left the cockpit at 02 and 0146 UTC to rest. This meant that the two least experienced pilots were now in command. Bonin remained in the right seat as pilot flying. Robert took the left seat as pilot not flying. The captain, the only pilot with significant experience in crisis situations, was in the crew rest area. 5 minutes later at 0206 UTC, Bonin warned the cabin crew over the intercom. "Listen, in 2 minutes we're going to be getting into an area where things are going to be moving around a little bit more than now. You'll want to take care." "Okay, we should sit down then?" The flight attendant, Marilyn, responded. "Well, I think that's not a bad idea. Give your friends a heads up." "Yeah, okay, I'll tell the others in the back. Thanks a lot. I'll call you back as soon as we're out of it." Bonin said. About 2 to 3 minutes later, the aircraft encountered the edge of the storm system. The cockpit voice recorder captured sounds consistent with hail or graupel pelting the exterior of the aircraft. The outside air temperature reading was unusual, much warmer than forecast for that altitude, a sign that they were entering the updraft zone of a massive cumulonimbus thunderstorm. At high altitude, in the heart of the intertropical convergence zone, these storms can reach into the stratosphere. They generate tremendous vertical winds, turbulence, and critically, they create conditions perfect for ice crystal formation. Not the supercooled water droplets that aircraft icing certification standards were designed for, but ice crystals, solid particles that behave differently, that can overwhelm heating systems in ways that weren't fully understood in 2009. Bonin reduced the aircraft's speed from Mach 0.82 to Mach 0.80, the recommended turbulence penetration speed. He turned the aircraft slightly to the left. Standard procedures, everything by the book. Then, at 02:10:05 UTC, ice crystals entered the pitot tubes. Within seconds, the 3 Thales AA pitot tubes began to fail. The ice crystals, measuring between 0.5 and 2 millimeters, adhered to the internal surfaces despite the electrical heating. The pressure measurements became erratic. The air data reference system, which relied on these pressure readings to calculate airspeed, began receiving inconsistent data. At 02:10:05 UTC, the autopilot disconnected. A cavalry charge alarm sounded in the cockpit, a loud, urgent tone designed to alert pilots to a critical change. The autothrust system disengaged 3 seconds later. The aircraft transitioned from normal law to alternate law 2. This is crucial to understand. In normal law, the A330's computers provide full flight envelope protection. The aircraft will not let you stall it, will not let you overstress it, will not let you make catastrophic errors. In alternate law, those protections are removed. The aircraft becomes essentially a conventional airplane that requires manual flying skill. But neither Bonin nor Robert had significant training in hand flying the A330 at high altitude in alternate law. This scenario, unreliable airspeed at cruise altitude, was not part of their training curriculum. "I have the controls," Bonin said. The aircraft started to roll right due to turbulence. Bonin deflected his side stick left to correct, but in alternate law, the aircraft's sensitivity to roll inputs had changed. He overcompensated. The plane rolled left. He corrected again. For the next 30 seconds, AF447 rolled alternately left and right as Bonin adjusted to the altered handling characteristics. And then Bonin did something that would seal the fate of everyone aboard. At 02:10:06 UTC, he pulled back sharply on the side stick, pitching the aircraft's nose up. The A330 began to climb, rapidly. The vertical speed peaked at 7,000 feet per minute. This was wrong. Completely wrong. At cruise altitude in turbulence, with unreliable airspeed indications, the correct procedure was simple. Maintain attitude, maintain thrust. Fly the aircraft straight and level until the instrument stabilized. Instead, the aircraft was climbing steeply, bleeding off airspeed with every passing second. At 02:10:10 UTC, the stall warning activated. A synthesized voice called out, "Stall! Stall! Stall!" in English, followed by an intentionally loud and annoying cricket sound, CRICK, CRICK, CRICK. The angle of attack, the angle between the wing and the oncoming air, had exceeded safe limits. The aircraft was approaching an aerodynamic stall. "What's this?" Robert asked, confusion in his voice. The airspeed displays had gone haywire. The captain's display showed the speed dropping from 274 knots to 52 knots in seconds. Impossible. The standby instruments showed different numbers. Nothing made sense. "There's no good speed indication," Bonin said. "We've lost the speeds then?" Robert asked. But here's what the pilots didn't know, what they couldn't have known without specific training. The airspeed indications were temporarily unreliable, but the other instruments, the attitude indicator, the vertical speed indicator, the altimeter, were all functioning perfectly. They had all the information they needed to fly the aircraft safely. The procedure for unreliable airspeed at high altitude was documented. It was in their quick reference handbook. Step 1. Maintain current attitude. Step 2. Set thrust to a specific level. Step 3. Fly the aircraft manually until the probes cleared, which typically took less than a minute. Neither pilot called for this procedure. Neither pilot executed it. Pay attention to your speed. Pay attention to your speed, Robert warned, noticing the climb rate. Okay, I'm descending, Bonin replied. But he wasn't descending. His side stick was still pulled back. The aircraft continued to climb. At Oro 2:10:13 UTC, Robert reached for the call button to summon Captain Dubois back to the cockpit. The situation was deteriorating fast, and they needed help. By 02:10:25 UTC, David Robert recognized at least part of the problem. Wing anti-ice, he called out, activating the wing de-icing system. He'd correctly guessed that ice had something to do with the loss of airspeed indications and feared ice formation on the wings themselves. At 02:10:34 UTC, the ACARS system transmitted what would be the last automated position report. 2.98 degrees north latitude, 30.59 degrees west longitude. The aircraft was approximately 1,100 kilometers from the Brazilian coast, roughly 560 nautical miles from the nearest land. 30 seconds after the pitot tubes had iced over, one of them began to function again. The airspeed indications started to return. At 02:10:36 UTC, the left side instruments showed a sharp rise in airspeed to 223 knots. The ice had cleared, temporarily. The probes were heating, the crystals melting. For a brief moment, the crew had accurate data again. The stall warning fell silent, but by this point, AF447 had climbed to 37,500 feet, 2,500 feet above its assigned altitude. The aircraft's airspeed had dropped to dangerously low levels. The nose was pitched up at an extreme angle, and critically, Bonin's side stick was still pulled back. We're in a climb, Bonin said at 02:10:41 UTC, as if just realizing what was happening. The aircraft reached a peak altitude of approximately 38,000 feet at Oro 2:11:10 UTC. At this height, the air is thin. The margin between flying too fast and flying too slow, the flight envelope, is razor thin. The angle of attack was 16 degrees. The engine thrust levers were pushed all the way forward to the toga position, takeoff go-around power, maximum thrust. Bonin was treating the situation like a go-around during landing. Pull back, climb, full power. But at 38,000 feet, this was exactly the wrong response. The laws of physics are unforgiving. As the A330 climbed, it lost speed. As it lost speed, the wings generated less lift. As they generated less lift, the aircraft began to fall. At Iro 2:11:13 UTC, the angle of attack reached 30 degrees, far beyond the critical angle. The smooth airflow over the wings broke apart into turbulent eddies. The wings stopped generating lift. AF447 entered a full aerodynamic stall. The aircraft began to descend, not gradually, but catastrophically. The vertical speed indicator showed 3,000 feet per minute down, then 5,000, then 7,000. The nose was still pitched up at 15 degrees, but the aircraft was falling like a stone through the night sky. And the stall warning? It had stopped. This was one of the cruelest ironies of AF447. At extremely low airspeeds, below 60 knots, the aircraft's computers assumed the pitot data was invalid and inhibited the stall warning. So as the aircraft fell in a fully developed stall, nose up, the warning that should have been blaring continuously was silent. When the pilots reduced the nose-up pitch slightly, the airspeed increased just enough for the computers to consider the data valid again. The stall warning would sound, stall, 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 but when they heard this warning, they interpreted it as meaning their situation was getting worse, not better, so they pulled back up, and the warning would stop again. The absence of the warning seemed to confirm they were doing the right thing. The psychology was devastating. At 02:11:37 UTC, David Robert said something crucial. Controls to the left. He was taking over, asserting command. He pushed his side stick forward, trying to lower the nose and recover from the stall. But Bonin, without informing anyone, was still pulling his side stick back. Here's where the Airbus side stick design became a critical factor. Unlike Boeing aircraft, where the control yokes are physically linked, when one pilot pulls back, the other pilot's yoke moves back too. Airbus side sticks are independent. Each pilot has a small joystick on the outer side of their seat. When one pilot moves his stick, the other pilot's stick doesn't move. There's no physical feedback. When both pilots input commands simultaneously, the flight control computers average the inputs. A warning sounds, dual input. A visual message appears on the display. But in the chaos with multiple alarms blaring, this warning was masked. Robert pushed forward. Bonin pulled back. The inputs canceled each other out. The aircraft continued to fall. At 02:11:42 UTC, Captain Dubois burst back into the cockpit, summoned by the urgency call. He'd been asleep for less than 10 minutes. "What's happening?" he demanded. But Dubois didn't physically take the controls. In the Airbus cockpit, there's no control yoke in the center to grab, no obvious way to override. He stood behind the two first officers, trying to make sense of the situation from the observer seat. "We've lost control of the plane," Bonin shouted. "We've totally lost control of the plane. We don't understand at all. We've tried everything," Robert added. The altitude was plummeting. 35,000 feet. 30,000 feet. 25,000 feet. The rate of descent was catastrophic, over 10,000 feet per minute at times. The flight director displays on the screens were showing conflicting information. The attitude indicator showed the nose pitched up, but they were descending. The stall warning was sounding intermittently, cricket sounds piercing through the chaos. Multiple computer systems were generating warning messages, flooding the cockpit with information that was impossible to process. And through it all, Pierre-Cédric Bonin kept his side stick pulled back. He never told his colleagues what he was doing. The side stick position wasn't visible to Robert or Dubois. They couldn't see that he was maintaining nose-up input. At 02:13:32 UTC, Robert said to himself, "Climb." He repeated it 4 times. "Climb, climb, climb, climb." Bonin heard this and replied, "But I've had the stick back the whole time." It was only at this moment, 02:13:40 UTC, exactly 49 seconds before impact, that the other pilots understood what had been happening. "No, no, no, don't climb," Dubois shouted. "No, no." "Descend, give me the controls, give me the controls," Robert commanded. Bonin released his side stick. Robert pushed forward, finally free to lower the nose without Bonin's opposite input. The aircraft's pitch attitude began to decrease. For a brief moment it seemed like recovery might be possible. But they were at 4,000 feet. The aircraft had fallen 34,000 feet, nearly 11,500 meters, in 3.5 minutes. The descent rate was still over 10,000 feet per minute. There wasn't enough altitude left to accelerate, to build the airspeed necessary to generate lift, to pull out of the dive. At 02:14:17 UTC, passing through 2,000 feet, the ground proximity warning system detected the fast-approaching ocean surface. A new alarm activated, overriding all others. "Pull up, pull up, pull up." Pierre-Cédric Bonin, without warning his colleagues, grabbed his side stick again and pulled it all the way back. "Damn it, we're going to crash," Robert screamed. "This can't be happening." "But what's happening?" Bonin said, his voice breaking. At 02:14:27 UTC, Captain Dubois spoke his final words. 10 degrees of pitch attitude. 1 second later, at 02:14:28 UTC, both flight recorders stopped recording. The last registered values were these: pitch attitude 16.2 degrees nose up, roll angle 5.3 degrees left, magnetic heading 270 degrees, ground speed 107 knots, vertical speed negative 10,912 feet per minute. The Airbus A330-203, registration FGZCP, struck the Atlantic Ocean belly first. The impact speed was 152 knots, roughly 175 miles per hour. The combination of vertical and horizontal velocity components meant the aircraft essentially pancaked into the water. At that speed, water is as hard as concrete. The fuselage ruptured instantly. All 228 people aboard, 216 passengers and 12 crew members, died on impact from extreme blunt force trauma. The aircraft disintegrated, scattering debris across a 200 by 600 meter area of ocean floor, 3,900 meters below the surface. From the moment the pitot tubes iced over to the moment of impact, 4 minutes and 23 seconds. 4 minutes and 23 seconds of confusion. 4 minutes and 23 seconds of the world's most advanced passenger aircraft falling from the sky. 4 minutes and 23 seconds during which 3 trained pilots in an airplane designed to be unflyable somehow managed to fly it straight into the ocean. The exact position was never precisely determined, but debris was later found at approximately 3 degrees 34 minutes north, 30 degrees 27 minutes west. At 02:20 UTC, AF447 was due to pass from Brazilian airspace into Senegalese airspace at waypoint Taysil. When the aircraft failed to make the scheduled position report, controllers in Senegal attempted to establish contact. No response. They asked the crew of another Air France flight, AF459, to try. No response. At 4:00 UTC, after repeated failed attempts to contact Flight 447, the controllers declared an emergency. Search and rescue operations began immediately. Aircraft from Brazil, France, Spain, and the United States scoured the mid-Atlantic. But in the pre-dawn darkness there was nothing to see. No emergency locator beacon signal, no mayday call, no radar trace, no satellite communication. 228 people had simply vanished into the night. What happened to Flight 447 would remain a mystery for nearly 2 years. The aircraft had disappeared in one of the deepest, most remote stretches of the Atlantic Ocean. Without the flight recorders, the so-called black boxes that contained the flight data and cockpit voice recordings, investigators could only speculate. But on June 6, 2009, the first pieces of debris were spotted floating on the surface. The vertical stabilizer, seat cushions, personal belongings, and bodies. 50 bodies were recovered in the days following the crash, including Pierre-Cédric Bonin's wife Isabelle, who had been in the passenger cabin. The images sent shockwaves around the world. The tail section of an Air France A330, one of the most advanced aircraft ever built, floating in pieces in the Atlantic. The questions came immediately. How could this happen? How could a state-of-the-art aircraft operated by one of the world's most respected airlines simply fall from the sky? What caused the crash? Was it terrorism? Mechanical failure? Pilot error? Weather? The preliminary investigation by France's Bureau d'Enquêtes et d'Analyse, the BEA, was severely hampered by the lack of flight recorders. The pitot tube problem was identified early through automated ACARS messages sent by the aircraft in its final minutes. 24 fault messages transmitted between 02:10 and 02:14 UTC told part of the story. Airspeed disagreements, flight control law changes, cabin altitude warnings. But without the detailed flight data, and without the cockpit voice recordings, the BEA couldn't determine what the pilots did in response to the emergency. They couldn't know the sequence of control inputs, the crew's decision-making process, the human factors that turned a temporary instrument failure into a catastrophic accident. The black boxes were somewhere on the ocean floor, nearly 13,000 feet below the surface, in a search area of thousands of square miles. Their locator beacons had a battery life of only 30 days. The underwater topography was extremely mountainous. The technology to search such depths barely existed. 4 major search expeditions were launched between 2009 and 2010. French, American, and international teams used submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, and side-scan sonar. They covered thousands of square nautical miles of ocean floor. They found nothing. As the months passed, the families of the victims lived with unbearable uncertainty. The airline industry struggled with the implications, and aviation safety investigators faced a haunting question. Could this happen again? Air France immediately began replacing the Thales AA pitot tubes on its entire A330 and A340 fleet. Airbus issued mandatory service bulletins. The European Aviation Safety Agency and the FAA issued airworthiness directives, prohibiting the use of the Thales C195 AA model. Airlines around the world accelerated replacement programs, but the fundamental questions remained unanswered. The pitot tubes had failed before on other flights. Pilots had encountered unreliable airspeed situations and recovered safely. Why didn't the crew of AF447 recover? What happened in that cockpit during those 4 minutes and 23 seconds? Without the black boxes, the full truth of Air France Flight 447 would remain buried at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. But the search wasn't over. In January 2011, the BEA commissioned an American company called Metron Scientific Solutions to develop a new search strategy using Bayesian probability analysis, essentially mathematical modeling, to determine the most likely location of the wreckage based on drift patterns, ocean currents, and the locations where debris had been found. On March 23, 2011, the fourth search phase began. This time, the searchers focused on a smaller, more refined area indicated by Metron's analysis. And on April 3, 2011, nearly 2 years after the crash, a team led by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution detected a large debris field on the ocean floor. 5 days later, on April 8, 2011, the BEA announced that they had found the wreckage of AF447. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were located, recovered from a depth of 3,980 meters, and transported to BEA headquarters in Paris. Despite spending 2 years underwater at crushing pressure, the recorders were intact. The data was readable. For the first time, investigators would hear the voices from the cockpit. They would see every control input, every system status, every parameter during those final minutes. They would understand exactly what happened, and what they discovered would be more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The final report of the BEA investigation was released on July 5, 2012, 3 years and 1 month after the crash. It was 227 pages long. It contained 25 safety recommendations, and it fundamentally changed how the aviation industry thinks about automation, pilot training, and aircraft design. But the story of AF447 isn't just about what went wrong that night over the Atlantic. It's about what happened afterward. The search, the investigation, the legal battles, the changes to aviation safety regulations, and the families who fought for years to ensure that their loved ones' deaths would lead to meaningful change. This was the crash that should have been impossible. The safest airplane in the sky, the most experienced airline in Europe. Technology designed to prevent exactly this type of accident. And yet 228 people died in 4 minutes and 23 seconds. The tragedy of Air France Flight 447 revealed uncomfortable truths about modern aviation, about the relationship between humans and machines, about training and experience, about complacency and assumptions. It exposed vulnerabilities that the industry didn't know existed or had chosen not to see. For nearly 2 years, the truth of what happened to Air France Flight 447 remained buried 3,900 meters below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The investigation was stuck. Without the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, the black boxes, the BEA could only speculate based on the automated ACARS messages and the limited debris recovered from the surface. 4 major underwater search operations were launched between 2009 and 2010. The Brazilian Navy, the French military, and international search teams deployed submarines, remotely operated vehicles, and side-scan sonar systems. They covered thousands of square nautical miles of ocean floor. The underwater topography was nightmarish. Mountainous terrain, steep ridges, treacherous depths. The black box's locator beacons, called underwater locator beacons, had a battery life of only 30 days. After 1 month, they fell silent. The search teams found nothing. The wreckage had vanished into the abyss. By mid-2010, hope was fading. The families of the 228 victims lived in agonizing limbo. The aviation industry had implemented immediate changes, replacing the Thalos AA pitot tubes, issuing new training directives. But fundamental questions remained unanswered. Could this happen again? What exactly had the pilots done in those final minutes? Was it equipment failure, human error, or something more complex? In July 2010, the BEA made a calculated decision. They hired Metron Scientific Solutions, an American company that specialized in probability analysis and search theory. Metron had successfully located the wreckage of the SS Central America, a ship that sank in 1857 using Bayesian statistical methods. The approach was methodical. Analyze all available data, ocean currents, drift patterns, locations where surface debris had been found, wind conditions, the aircraft's last known position, and generate a probability map showing the most likely location of the underwater wreckage. For 6 months, Metron's team of mathematicians, oceanographers, and statisticians worked on the analysis. On January 20, 2011, They published their study on the BEA website. It identified a specific area where the wreckage had a high probability of being located. The search zone was smaller, more refined than previous efforts. On March 23, 2011, the fourth search phase began. This time, the approach was different. The BEA contracted with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, one of the world's premier deep-sea research facilities. The team, led by principal engineers Michael Purcell and David Gallo, deployed from a smaller vessel, the Alucia, with 3 REMUS 6000 autonomous underwater vehicles owned by the Waite Institute for Discovery. These weren't traditional towed sonar systems. The REMUS 6000 AUVs were sophisticated robots that could operate autonomously at depths up to 6,000 meters, mapping the ocean floor with side-scan sonar while navigating complex terrain independently. They were perfect for the job. The search focused on the probability zone identified by Metron's analysis. The AUVs covered overlapping swaths, creating detailed sonar images of the seafloor. The terrain was challenging, steep ridges, rocky outcrops, but the technology was up to the task. On April 3, 2011, 1 week into the fourth search phase, one of the REMUS vehicles detected a large debris field on the ocean floor. The sonar images showed unmistakable shapes, engine parts, fuselage sections, the distinctive profile of aircraft wreckage. 5 days later, on April 8, 2011, the BEA announced they had found AF447. The wreckage was at a depth of 3,980 meters, approximately 13,060 feet below the surface. It was located in a relatively flat, silty area, not the mountainous terrain originally believed to be the final resting place. The debris field was compact, measuring roughly 200 by 600 meters, suggesting the aircraft had hit the water largely intact before breaking apart. And crucially, the black boxes were there. On May 1, 2011, the flight data recorder was recovered. 2 days later, on May 3, 2011, the cockpit voice recorder was brought to the surface. Both recorders had spent nearly 2 years underwater at crushing pressure, approximately 400 times atmospheric pressure, in near-freezing water temperatures of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. The recovery was, in the words of Tony Cable, a former UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch investigator, a great achievement. Standard procedure after recovering recorders from underwater is to store and transport them while immersed in fresh water to minimize corrosion and salt crystal deposition. The recorders were placed in freshwater containers and transported aboard a French Navy ship to Paris. The journey took just over a week. On May 12, 2011, the recorders arrived at BEA headquarters in Le Bourget. The data extraction began immediately. Despite the extreme conditions, the memory chips inside both recorders were intact. The information was readable. Within 24 hours, investigators had access to the complete flight data, every system parameter, every control input, every warning generated, from takeoff to impact. The cockpit voice recorder provided the audio from the final hours of the flight, including the chaotic last 4 minutes. For the first time, investigators could hear the voices from the cockpit. They could see exactly what Bonin, Robert, and Dubois had done, second by second. They could understand the sequence of events that led to the crash. What they discovered was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The preliminary findings were released in July 2011 in the BEA's third interim report. But the complete picture, the detailed analysis, the human factors investigation, the systemic failures, would take another year. On July 5, 2012, exactly 3 years, 1 month, and 4 days after the crash, the BEA released its final report. It was 227 pages long. It contained 25 safety recommendations, and it fundamentally changed how the aviation industry understood the relationship between humans and automated systems. The BEA's conclusion was stark. The obstruction of the pitot probes by ice crystals during cruise was a phenomenon that was known but misunderstood by the aviation community at the time of the accident. The temporary loss of airspeed information was classified as a failure condition that pilots should have been able to handle. But the reality was far more complex. The investigation identified multiple contributory factors. Yes, the pitot tubes failed, but that failure lasted only about 60 seconds. The instruments recovered. The crew had accurate data, yet the aircraft remained in a stall for 3.5 minutes until impact. Why? The analysis revealed a cascade of systemic failures. First, the design of the Airbus flight control system. When both pilots made simultaneous inputs on their independent side sticks, the system averaged the commands. But unlike Boeing's mechanically linked yokes, there was no physical feedback. Robert couldn't feel that Bonin was pulling back. The dual input warning that sounded was masked by multiple other alarms. Second, training. Neither Bonin nor Robert had ever practiced hand-flying the A330 at high altitude in alternate law. They had never experienced a high-altitude stall in the simulator. The scenario was considered too unlikely to warrant training time. The BEA found 16 previous incidents similar to AF447, other crews encountering unreliable airspeed at cruise altitude. Most showed poor understanding of the situation, rare implementation of the unreliable airspeed procedure, and stall warnings that were perceived but mostly not believed. Third, human factors. The startle effect when the autopilot disconnected, combined with the destabilization of the flight path, led to a complete degradation of crew resource management. The pilots lost situational awareness. They never diagnosed that they were in a stall, despite the warning sounding intermittently for 54 seconds at one point. Fourth, the design of warnings and protections. At very low speeds, below 60 knots, the stall warning was inhibited because the computers assumed the data was invalid. This created a perverse situation where reducing the nose-up attitude caused the stall warning to sound, making it seem like the wrong action. The absence of a direct angle of attack indicator meant pilots had no intuitive understanding of the wing's actual condition. The BA issued 41 total safety recommendations throughout the investigation, with 25 in the final report. They called for better pilot training in manual flying at high altitude, exposure to stall scenarios, improved understanding of alternate law, and clear procedures for unreliable airspeed situations. They recommended making angle of attack indicators mandatory on instrument panels. They called for extending underwater locator beacon battery life from 30 to 90 days, and changing the frequency to increase detection range from 1 kilometer to 4 kilometers. The report recommended improved communication between aircraft and their bases even in remote zones, not covered by air traffic control, primarily for search and rescue operations. They called for changes to pitot tube certification standards to better account for ice crystal icing, not just supercooled water icing. But perhaps most importantly, the investigation forced the aviation industry to confront uncomfortable questions about automation. For decades, the industry had moved toward increasingly automated aircraft with computers designed to prevent pilot error. The philosophy was clear: humans make mistakes, so minimize the human's role in flying the airplane. AF447 revealed the flaw in this thinking. When the automation failed or disconnected, pilots who had become dependent on it were unprepared to fly manually. They had lost the fundamental skills, the muscle memory, the situational awareness, the ability to recognize and recover from unusual attitudes that previous generations of pilots had maintained through constant practice. The industry called it automation complacency. But the problem was deeper than complacency. It was a fundamental mismatch between human capabilities and system design. The computers were so good at flying that pilots rarely flew manually, but when they needed to take over in an emergency, they were expected to transition instantly from monitoring to active flying, to diagnose complex failures, and to execute precise recovery procedures, all while experiencing surprise, stress, and cognitive overload. The AF447 final report became required reading at airlines worldwide. Training programs were overhauled. Simulators now included high-altitude stall recovery training, unreliable airspeed scenarios, and exposure to alternate law. Airlines began emphasizing manual flying skills, requiring pilots to disconnect the autopilot regularly and fly portions of routine flights by hand. Airbus modified the A330's flight control software to provide clearer warnings and to prevent re-engagement of autoflight systems with unreliable airspeed data. The company issued service bulletins requiring changes to the way simultaneous side-stick inputs were handled. By 2014, the FAA had streamlined requirements for angle of attack indicators, though they didn't become mandatory for commercial aviation. The impact rippled through the entire aviation industry. Boeing, recognizing that similar issues could affect their aircraft, updated training requirements. Regulatory agencies worldwide revised certification standards for pitot tubes, for crew training, for human factors integration in cockpit design. But the legacy of AF447 extends beyond technical changes. It forced a philosophical reckoning. The crash demonstrated that making aircraft pilot-proof can have unintended consequences. That automation, while tremendously valuable, cannot completely replace human skill and judgment. That the human must remain in the loop, not as a backup to be called upon only when systems fail, but as an integral, continuously engaged part of the aviation system. The families of the 228 victims fought for years to ensure their loved ones' deaths would lead to meaningful change. Some found closure when the wreckage was located and remains were recovered. Others continued to battle in court, seeking accountability from Air France, Airbus, and Thalys. A criminal investigation in France examined potential involuntary manslaughter charges. In October 2022, 13 years after the crash, Air France and Airbus faced trial, both pleading not guilty. Today, pilots around the world know the story of AF447. They know the call sign. They know what happened in those 4 minutes and 23 seconds. They know that it could happen to anyone, that a simple instrument failure, combined with surprise, confusion, and inadequate training, can turn the safest airplane in the sky into a falling death trap. Air France changed the flight number from AF447 to AF445, and later to AF4085. As of 2024, the airline is phasing out its entire A330 fleet, replacing them with the more efficient A350-900. The first A330 retired was FGZCL on May 31, 2024, nearly 15 years to the day after AF447's departure from Rio. The crash of Air France Flight 447 remains the deadliest accident in Air France's history, and the deadliest involving the Airbus A330. 228 people died because ice crystals blocked 3 small tubes, and 3 trained pilots couldn't understand what was happening to their aircraft. The tragedy proved that in modern aviation, the most dangerous failures aren't mechanical, they're human. And the most important safety systems aren't computers, they're training, awareness, and the fundamental skills that keep pilots connected to the act of flying. The safest airplane in the sky crashed because we forgot that flying is, ultimately, a human endeavor.